Hello, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Project on Prosperity and Development. I'm Meredith Broadbent. I'm a senior advisor, non-resident with the Scholl Chair in International Business here at CSIS. And together we're looking at the Generalized System of Preferences and the question of renewing it. It's been expired for about 4 years, putting a lot of disruption in our economic relationships with developing countries. There was a bill recently reported from the Ways and Means Committee, which is H.R. 7986, 25 yeses and 17 noes. Hasn't been considered on the floor yet, and concern about what the state of this legislation will be going into the lame duck session or at the end of this session. The GSP program lapsed first during the Trump administration and despite ongoing discussions, the Biden administration really hasn't prioritized its reauthorization. So there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of beneficiary countries that receive duty-free benefits under this program to encourage economic development and growth. Businesses relying on this program are also suffering the disruption and putting into question really the reliability of the United States and being a consistent trading partner with some very important countries in the world. There are really about probably 115, 110 beneficiaries, depending on the year. And all of these countries are really looking to the U.S. To make a decision to renew this program. At CSIS, we wanted to kind of look at it in terms of the larger geopolitical picture that is happening at this point, with more competition coming from China, more aggressive pressure that China is putting on countries in the region. Our sense is that this is a broader geopolitical issue that really should be looked at in that regard, that it means U.S. leadership, U.S. ability to balance a lot of the pressure that China is putting on our trading partners. So with that, we are really lucky to have a great panel to talk about these issues. And I think what I'll do is introduce each of them separately before their comments. Actually, I should say who's here so you know who's going to be speaking, and then I'll give some more detail on their bio beforehand. Chairman Kemp, who's former chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee represented Michigan, did a lot of, he works for PwC, an accounting firm, giving tax advice, economy-wide business advice on proposed policy changes that U.S. business will be facing. And he provides insight on the global business environment, including issues specific to the OECD and other tax initiatives. He served in Congress from 1991 to 2015 and from the 4th Congressional District of Michigan. And he was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee from 2010 to 2014. So I'll allow Mr. Chairman Kemp to kind of lay the groundwork and describe the environment that the GSP proponents are facing at this point.
Well, thank you. Meredith and I got to know each other when she was at the Ways and Means Committee, and I was a member there. So when she said she needed some help over here, I thought I got to come over and do it. And it's great to be with this panel and to see Ambassador McKinley again, because we worked together on the Colombian trade agreement, and he was very influential in getting that agreement passed in the Congress, and it lingered for a number of years, but finally got into play. And Colombia is a really important partner for the United States as well. So it's great to be here. And I think there hasn't been much of a trade agenda over the last several years, and there was at least USMCA in the last administration. And so because of that, I think renewing GSP becomes even more important. It's been a difficult time because I think you see a lot of attention on tariffs, and the Trump administration put in a number of tariffs, and those tariffs have not only been left in place but expanded by the Biden administration. So the idea that there'd be a tariff-free program is kind of counter to where sort of the thinking has been going. So that's kind of putting into context why there's why it's sort of difficult for people to wrap their heads around it. And I should also say, I'm here in my personal capacity, not as a PwC employee. And so they would disavow anything I would say here. So, but I think that's part of the environment that's changed. And also, we do have a divisive political environment. We have very close majorities in the House and Senate, and so it makes it even harder to move legislation. I left Congress when social media was kind of in its infancy, and my staff would always sort of do it. I didn't pretend it was me, but it would be, he will be here at this time, so it was always third person. But the pressure on these members in social media is really a lot more challenging, not to mention media is different and all of that. So I think it makes it really harder to sort of develop policy because it sort of gets strangled in its crib before policy really gets going. But I do think that the geopolitical aspects of this make a strong case for why this should be renewed. And with China actively developing relationships with developing countries, and much of the policy, when you talk about it, there is bipartisan support for how do we develop counterweights to China? How do we address this sort of challenge from China that we get in many areas, but particularly in the economic area? So I do think there is a case to be made that this helps us, and certainly after COVID and the pandemic, when there was a question about supply chains from China, having alternatives of where supplies can come from, whether it's friend shoring or I don't think there'd be that to me is something that you certainly hear talked about in the business community, the need for that, to have alternatives and not to have all your eggs in one basket, particularly with critical supplies, whether they be health or as we saw in the pandemic. And again, that's also not only just sort of geopolitical, and what you get with GSP is sort of values, sustainability, for example, transparency, international standards. Those things come into play whenever you do have a GSP relationship as well. So there's benefits there. And I think some of my China comments really also fall under the national security umbrella because we, as I said, we saw what happens when you rely too much on one place for your critical supplies. Ultimately, I don't think GSP is a partisan issue. I think there are some partisan concerns that have been raised about certain aspects. But you see several pieces of bipartisan legislation that have been introduced. You had a bipartisan sort of agreement last year between three of what I call the big four, chairman of Finance, Ways and Means, and ranking members of Finance and Ways and Means. Three of the four agreed on sort of moving forward in a direction, and it didn't happen. But I think as we hear from the other panelists and before we get to the questions, I think the rest of this year, it will be a lot about government funding. And when I said there's these challenges that come up, we're either doing a debt limit increase or doing government funding. And so there's always this kind of going to the next crisis, and it makes it harder for the Congress to, I think, address things like this that are important, have bipartisan support, can really help the United States both geopolitically and from a national security standpoint. So whenever there's a lame duck session, which I think there will be, because clearly the 6-month funding bill didn't go anywhere, there's an opportunity. And I always believe that you try as hard as you can, you never give up. Isn't it Winston Churchill who said never, never, never give up? And because you just never know when the sun, the moon, and stars are going to align. And so I think all of the work that I heard just as before we came out about the work that's being done on the Hill, the contact with legislators, and we can get into that later as we get into the specifics. But thank you for having me here, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else in their comments.
Thank you, Chairman Kemp. Appreciate that. Our next speaker, we're very honored to have Ambassador Romualdez from the Philippines. And he has been lucky to serve two of its presidents, President Duarte and President Marcos, and be in Washington representing the Philippines during the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and during this election season, which I'm sure is interesting. And we appreciate your perspective to be able to tell us from a beneficiary country's perspective, a country that's receiving duty-free benefits under this program, or was until it expired. What's it like to have it expired for so long, and the difficulties that you're facing and what you're seeing in your region.
Well, first of all, let me thank you and thank the CSIS for inviting me to this panel discussion, which is very important for us. The GSP program, we've had that for many years, but it's been suspended it's been on hold for the past 3 or 4 years now. It's benefited not only the Philippines in terms of our relationship, but it also has helped in our relationship on the security side. The GSP program has lapsed for so many years now, and I think the urgency of having this reauthorization program approved again by the U.S. Congress is very important, especially at this time when we are facing a lot of these challenges in the region. I think it's very clear that China is using its economic power and economic resources into influencing countries in our region. And we call that now the economic enticement, which means they will give you, if you stay away from a country that they feel is not in their good terms, which is the United States, obviously. We are in the center of all of this right now, and we feel that the GSP program, which we've had for many years, is just the beginning of what we think is important for our relationship, because economic prosperity means economic security for all. And I think that it's not only good for the United States, but it's good for many countries, developing countries that are also asking for a renewal or the benefits from this GSP program. In fact, we're very grateful to the Argentinian ambassador who hosted a reception last night, precisely putting together a number of countries that have looking for seeing the GSP program being renewed. And it's the same kind of atmosphere that they feel that they need this program to be able to precisely fight off any kind of economic coercion that's coming from countries like China today. In our case, we have already made it clear that we are not going to accept the kind of aggression that we're facing right now. I'm sure everyone knows that we're right in the center of the storm, so to speak. But economically, it's important for us to be able to fight back too. And it's what is that old saying? You don't give people fish; you teach them how to fish so that they can earn their living. Well, in this case, you need to have a program that will give us the economic resources, and we don't want to keep on going to the United States asking for aid or for help. In cases where we're facing right now, we want to be able to be a real partner. And economic prosperity will give us the resources to be able to buy what we need to be a real defense partner of the United States. So I think the GSP is just the beginning of what we think is important not only for this country, but for other countries that are also asking for the same thing. And let me just point out that also, economically, it's beneficial for the United States. Last night, I met with a CEO of a company that's been operating in the Philippines for the past 20 years, and the GSP program is very important to him. He had to cut down on the number of employees. At the same time, his exports to the United States has also cut down, precisely because the GSP program has not been in place for some time. And yet, the prices of what he was supplying the United States is now gone up. So inflation, again, has some obviously a connection to this program. So there's no question about it. We do have a bipartisan support, but there are so many conditions that I think that they should try to tweak it a little bit to make it a little more viable for countries, including the Philippines, to be able to come up with the right kind of atmosphere for this program.
Great. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. And our next speaker is Pete Ruggiero, from President and CEO of Crayola, which is a Hallmark company. And Pete manages the supply chain for Crayola all across the world, which is headquartered actually in Easton, Pennsylvania. He built Crayola into an innovation company and enabled the expansion of Crayola's U.S. and international business units. Under his leadership, Crayola's global supply chain has been transformed and expanded with enhanced networks, the automation of U.S. manufacturing, and the execution of numerous sustainability initiatives, including a 3-megawatt solar farm at Crayola's corporate headquarters in Easton. So I'm looking at those crayons and thinking, I wish I had some grandchildren I could give them to, but I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, and it's an honor to speak here today. And I'll speak from the context of a global brand and how GSP has been an enabler to our overall business strategy. And it's a major linchpin of our strategy, and it's challenging us right now as it's been expired for far too long. At Crayola, we help parents and educators raise creatively alive kids. That's our mission. And we accomplish that as the market leader in the children's creative expression category through a broad range of products, experiences, and content. I expect most of us have a favorite crayon color. And I expect most of us have some favorable childhood memories of using the products that my company produces. So I'm very grateful to lead that company. With respect to our products, wood case colored pencils represent 20% of our company's annual sales, and the 12-count colored pencil is actually a key item on the back-to-school list. It's actually number 6 units sold in the office category during the key back-to-school selling season. And it, along with the 24-count crayon and the 10-count Crayola marker, are prominent on every teacher's list, and this actually says preferred by teachers. The 12-count colored pencil and all of our colored pencils are actually manufactured in Brazil, and until recently, obviously, had received favorable GSP import duty treatment. Colored pencils, markers, and crayons as a result of the back-to-school list are so tightly linked to our global supply chain strategy to provide superior close-to-market responsiveness for us to be able to meet consumer demands and what's ordered to us by our customers. While we source our pencils from Brazil, we manufacture 3 billion regular-size crayons in Easton, Pennsylvania, and 700 million markers there as well, along with paints, watercolors, modeling compounds, creativity kits, and silly putty. This manufacturing capability is achieved through the efforts of more than 500 skilled Crayola employees. Our plants in Pennsylvania represent most of our production of those products, and capital investments sustain that, as well as a 100% renewable energy strategy, the linchpin of which is the 3-megawatt, 33,000 solar panel that is on our property in Easton, Pennsylvania. Now, with respect to these colored pencils, 2 decades ago, our company embarked on a strategic partnership with our global wood case colored pencil supplier to consolidate all of our sourcing to the supplier's Brazilian manufacturing operation. And that enabled our supplier to expand their renewable tropical pine plantation. Today, no other pencil supplier on the planet can supply the 1 billion colored pencils required for us to meet our customer and consumer demands. Based on the partnership struck so many years ago, a 37 square mile tropical pine plantation in Prata, Brazil is nurtured, and the supplier's enterprise is zero carbon. Crayola derives the benefits of this large capacity, efficient and zero carbon operation while delivering superior Crayola colored pencils, our 3rd largest product line, to our customers and consumers. The supplier in Brazil sustains a workforce of 2,400 skilled employees, and they offer responsible sourcing initiatives including college educations, family programs, and physical fitness. Half of these employees are specifically engaged in the production of Crayola colored pencils, making them at risk with GSP's continued not being in effect. Inherent in the creation of this valuable colored pencil ecosystem that we've created was the assumption of the perpetual existence of GSP, and that has permitted duty-free importation of colored pencils from Brazil to the U.S. This long-term lapse of GSP duty-free treatment has already adversely affected Crayola. A couple of points here. The lost profit and cash flows from duties paid on Brazilian pencil imports, combined with our decision 2 years ago to help families and teachers impacted by inflationary pressures by not increasing our prices on back-to-school items, has constricted our brand building expenditures, our hourly employee profit sharing incentives, and our capital investments in our U.S. manufacturing. When GSP is reinstated on a retroactive basis, which is very important, Crayola will use the escrow duty payments to accelerate U.S. manufacturing sustaining projects and will expand brand building activities. The growth that is expected from brand building investments and the manufacturing expansion will result in increased U.S. manufacturing jobs. Now, if there's no retroactive application of GSP renewal, or if the duties continue to be applied to Brazilian-sourced Crayola colored pencils, Crayola's U.S. manufacturing sustaining projects will continue to be constrained, which will significantly impact our global competitiveness. And finally, with respect to Brazil, in any scenario where GSP is not renewed at all, or sourcing of colored pencils from Brazil, with all of the goodness that Brazilian employees and communities and for the environment would become far more difficult to sustain over the long term. Over time, because of the challenging economics, Crayola would be required to aggressively consider diversifying its supply of colored pencils to other countries.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Ambassador McKinley, if you may give us a few words. You have served all over the world, but on frontline places in Afghanistan and Brazil and Colombia and Peru over many years of your Foreign Service career. I think giving you a feel for how the U.S. manages its relations and position with developing countries that we're seeking to have stronger relations with, and how some of these smaller tools can be employed to move things in a positive direction.
So, Meredith, thank you for the invitation. And Chairman Kemp, terrific to be with you again. And for the wider audience, harking back to an era of bipartisan policy on trade issues, which was not so long ago, but seems prehistoric right now. As we look at the current state of play on GSP, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's a part of a broader geopolitical concern that's in play, and it's how the United States relates to international markets more generally. And this is not a partisan point. I think we've seen over the last 8 to 10 years a shift on both sides of the aisle, in which there are greater questions about what national economic security means. And the focus really has been on resiliency in our economy, especially post-COVID. It's been on issues like nearshoring, the greater utilization of tariffs to protect local manufacturing, and to encourage digitalization, transformation of our economy. The question is that a policy that can be sustained long-term in an environment in which the rest of the world continues to trade with itself, build new agreements, and where the challenge of China is on such a scale? Because if we want to do this in terms of figures, and I thought Chairman Kemp's point about the environment being one of budgets right now, to suggest that GSP is a small amount and it will still cost the U.S. Treasury a couple of billion of dollars in tax revenue a year potentially by reinstating it, it has to be debated on other levels. And I think Pete Ruggiero just laid out one very important aspect of this, which is the issue of inputs. The United States economy, we may be looking at changing supply chains, but we're not going to get rid of supply chains for our economy in any of the industries we work. So it's doing it smart, doing it with friends, doing it in a way which supports U.S. companies and allies and friends abroad. And it's important to remember that GSP basically benefits manufacturers in the United States, but doesn't challenge the creation of U.S. jobs. And it's mostly in products that aren't strategic in any way, from textiles to plastics, to wood pencils. And so it's important, I think, to try to frame this discussion more widely. And as we look at it, it's a question of whether we're at a stage where we can recalibrate our thinking on trade in the United States. GSP is a great place to start precisely because it doesn't generate a lot of conflict, contrary opinions. But as the ambassador pointed out, placing too many conditionalities on its renewal at a moment when world trade patterns are changing as dramatically as they are would be a challenge. So for embassies in the field, an important tool for dialogue with governments, but it's more important for the United States in geostrategic terms and keeping up and showing that we have an approach which invites bilateral trade and investment participation. And I'll close by just noting what the challenge is. It's on two levels. We have a proliferation of regional trade blocs right now that do not include the United States. And it's everything from RCCP to CPTPP in Asia, China being members of at least RCCP. You have the Africa Free Trade Agreement, Mercosur, ASEAN countries. You have countries pursuing bilateral agreements. Chile has 65 of them. South Korea, 21. Japan, 16. In other words, the world didn't stop because we decided we didn't want to engage in trade. And all of these networks are building up around us. And in and part of all of this, Chinese exports. Since 2018, Chinese exports have gone up globally over 900 billion. In East Asia Pacific, from 636 billion to 924 billion. Europe from 472 to 712 billion. Middle East from 144 to 244. You get the picture. In other words, this isn't an issue of the rest of the world standing still as we decide we're going to just deal with our own local economy. We're going to begin to lose out in this paradigm shift in the global economy. Free trade agreements per se may be dead, but not globalization. And so GSP is an important walking around sort of ticket for the United States to engage with over 100 countries. And I'll close with, and it's incredibly important for development in the least developed economies, Pacific Islands, Caribbean islands, certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and that should be an objective for us as well.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. I wanted to talk a bit about supply chains. I mean, we've had an administration that has looked at trying to make supply chains more secure since the disruptions of the pandemic. We've had a lot of talk in Congress about it. We're here 4 years later, and it's very difficult to figure out what the government can do. But there's certain things in terms of maintaining consistency, keeping the legal framework where everybody can depend on it, that makes supply chains more secure. And GSP doubles down on that because it encourages diversification from China, which we have realized it's not great to be completely dependent on China for certain components and inputs. Can you talk a little bit about how GSP supports diversified supply chains?
I'll take a stab at it, keep it short. Essentially, when you're covering 3,500 to 5,000 products, depending on how you define them, absolutely it's supporting diversification. It's supporting diversification precisely because dozens of countries that otherwise would be unlikely to develop some of these industries or exports without the U.S. market do so. Although percentage-wise for countries like the Philippines or Brazil, it may not be terrifically important in the macro picture, it is incredibly important for certain sectors. And again, as we look at this, as we look to diversify away from dependence on one supplier, and what the opportunities are to expand trade relations with countries under GSP on products that, I repeat, do not threaten the employment base in the United States, it's something well worth restoring.
Well, I would add to that 24 years ago, and I was leading Crayola's global sourcing at the time, and we specifically looked at this live example, and we evaluated where we were currently sourcing Chile and Indonesia. We looked at China at the time. We were also sourcing a bit from Brazil. And the equation of the quality, the potential for building a sustainability through a renewable forest, the quality coming out of the colored pencils there, and the cost structure with the GSP made that a more attractive option. At the time, we were looking at China also as an option, and Brazil was the best option, so that's why we moved there. I would say that the environmental impacts and the 1,000 stable Brazilian jobs that were achieved as a result of GSP, and all of the benefits to those employees of the time, and the relationships that we have built with the country of Brazil and with our supplier there, none of that would have happened without the GSP being in place.
Yeah, and the fact that import-sensitive products are not eligible for GSP, as defined in the statute, makes it a great structure for building these kind of mutually beneficial partnerships where you're preserving manufacturing in the U.S. by getting those needed components and raw materials here to make them in Pennsylvania. So we really appreciate your case study on what you've been able to accomplish. What do you think, Mr. Kemp?
Well, I think trade has become more difficult for a couple of reasons. And one of them is, first, the demands for what a trade agreement would do has increased. I mean, if you look back to NAFTA, which after that, it certainly became a very high-profile issue for labor to have labor and environmental standards and agreements. So there were a number of years where that was a very controversial thing. With USMCA, there were labor and environmental standards put in, so that was sort of been resolved over time. And then I think you had a change in terms of, from a sort of a global market perspective. I remember people would come in, USTR would say to me, "This is a no-brainer, trade what they do, they'll do best, what we do, we'll do best." Where there's been a change, maybe more to what is sort of a local American industrial policy view of this issue as opposed to this global market view of what trade can do. And I think that's been a significant change. And the benefits of trade tend to be dispersed. And by that I mean I can maybe get a TV cheaper. I'm talking about trade writ large, not necessarily GSP. But the sort of downside or the pain of trade is very focused when you have the plant close in a member of Congress's district and those people lose jobs. So I think part of that is the structure, what happens where the benefits are kind of dispersed throughout the economy, and we all get a bit of a benefit from some of the trade actions, but the pain, the downside. So I think that's why it's made trade a very difficult issue. So. And not to mention just that it was sort of labor and environment, but TAA became a part of a link to trade agreements. And now that is what is being linked to GSP because there are no trade agreements moving. So it's added another kind of hurdle you have to get over to try to get this done, not to mention the merits of GSP, which I think there is bipartisan acknowledgement of that and bipartisan support for that. But it's moving it through the Congress, which I think is the challenge right now.
Ambassador, could you talk a little bit more about your region and how countries, your neighboring countries, are thinking about their trade relations with China and whether they are seeking at least equal relations with the United States?
Well, as I said, I think that China is using its economic power right now into influencing many countries, not only in our region, but all over the world, clearly. But in our case, in our region, there is what I said, the economic enticement, which is really clearly, if you have closer relationships or relations with the United States and other Western countries, they would go to other countries in the ASEAN and tell them that we will give you more potential investments, infrastructure, whatever it is that they have. Obviously, because of our current situation right now, we're right in the front line. We are in the receiving end of some sort of economic coercion coming from China. They have lessened their investments. They have given us difficulty in our exports, in terms, especially exports that we've been exporting to China for many, many years, like bananas, for instance. They are held in their ports for some reason or the other until it rots, and there goes the export. So other countries in the ASEAN region are benefiting from this situation that on the competition between the United States and China. In our case, we have made it clear that we want to try to divide that, and meaning to say that we want to have good relations with China in terms of the economic trade, but they still connect that to our relationship with the United States on the defense side. And so that's why I think it's very clear that we have to go not only to the United States, but other countries to be able to look for other areas where we can have a better relationship in the economic sphere. And it's been affecting, you can see where it's going right now. And I think that you're going to have a lot of these types of challenges that we will be facing, alliances with the U.S. and other countries that are pushing back on the kind of aggressive behavior that they're doing right now.
I appreciate it. In terms of poverty alleviation in the Philippines, can you see beneficial effects of GSP in the past when it was in effect?
Yes, definitely. As I said, there are a number of American companies that are operating in the Philippines, especially in the provinces. The travel goods industry, for instance, where the cost of living is not very high, and so the employment is quite good. People are very happy with working with these American companies. So the GSP benefits our economy and helping our workers and making a good living, and the prices that are, when they import it to the United States, obviously becomes cheaper, and so there's a benefit. There's no question about it. It's not a one-way street, and so I think we've made this argument quite clearly. But the conditions that are being set by some members of Congress on labor, for instance, cannot be the same as what you have here in the United States, because, as I said, it's much cheaper in some areas, especially in the outlying provinces in the Philippines. That doesn't necessarily mean that the kind of rate of payment or their employer benefits are not necessarily the same that's needed that you have here in the United States. So that's one example, for instance. The other is that the raw material used, we can't have they're now requiring us to have a 50% component that to be able to qualify for GSP. Again, you have to do that on a graduated scale. It can't be all imposed in just one, and so you'll never be able to qualify for that type of program. So these are things that we need to thresh out, and I think that we're hoping that many of those who are with us in terms of having this renewal will point that out to the members of Congress. But it is very critical for the United States to have the GSP program renewed, really, in countries around the world, most especially in the Asian region, where you are being strongly challenged right now by China.
Right.
Well, and AGOA allows for the U.S. addition to count to the content requirement. So there is a way to maybe address that concern.
I hope that we can, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the statute is, when you read it, the length of the conditionality on the countries is really quite extraordinary, because you have every interest group kind of represented there with a demand on the country linked to a benefit that keeps expiring all the time. So Congress does have a lot to think about as they go through the process here and get to conference and so forth, just to make it realistic so we're getting the benefit that we all seek. I know that your team, Mr. Ruggiero, was up on the Hill recently. Any sense on how the members in representing Pennsylvania or your district, your facility, are thinking about this issue?
So Representative Wild in the 7th District of Pennsylvania has been extremely supportive of what we're trying to do. She has spoken with us many times. She visited our crayon and marker plant, and We've also had engagement with Lloyd Smucker from a nearby district. And then, of course, we have employees from Congressman Cartwright and Congressman Fitzpatrick's districts. And they've all been very supportive of it. I think what's interesting is when we talk about the benefits of GSP on Brazil, they're understanding that. What surprises them when we tell them our story is how GSP lapsing is impacting U.S. jobs, U.S. manufacturing, U.S. capital availability, and ultimately long-term brand development. That's a surprising point. But in all cases, when we share the story that I covered in my opening remarks, there's full understanding, and we're getting that kind of support.
Can you say a little bit more about brand development? That was interesting.
Well, when we lapse GSP, then there's constraints on a company's profits, and decisions have to be made. There is an equation in a company's financial systems. So whether it's decisions that have to be difficult decisions on capital investments or difficult decisions on brand company growing, brand growing investments that we would make on investing in advertising or product development to grow our business, you have to make those difficult decisions, and those decisions are being made right now.
Yeah. And my sense is that looking at the numbers, that there's a lot of small companies on either end of these relationships, and it's not really the Walmarts of the world that are using this program to a huge amount. It's more smaller companies that developing country companies have been able to partnership with.
Yeah, I would add, and I wasn't able to participate in the activities yesterday, but in a previous visits on Capitol Hill, I toured with several other companies. And there was one extremely compelling story where a company had been manufacturing in China and went to Cambodia under the promise of GSP, moved their production. As a longtime operations finance person, I get the complexities of doing that. They set up their manufacturing there. It's the viability for their business, and then GSP that is lapsed. And it's on a small company, a large company like Crayola, we find our way around, we have flexibility, but a small company with a limited product range, and it's very difficult for them. So I suspect there's many small companies that are challenged right now because of the situation.
Right. And we had heard stories early on of poor companies putting some of the duties on their credit card, hoping that it would be renewed and so forth, which is just a scary, sad thought. Okay, well, anybody have any sort of closing comments or reflections? I think with Ambassador, you may talk about I'd just like to hear a little bit more about how you're seeing the Belt and Road Initiative in its detail and the infrastructure offers and so forth. And once we do GSP, we probably need to do other things.
For the Belt and Road.
Yeah.
Well, we were promised quite a bit in the early years of my being here in Washington, the Belt and Road program of China, but we didn't receive very much. I guess they didn't believe us that we wanted to have a good relation with them.
Right.
But they're learning now that I think that many countries that have the Belt and Road initiatives, which mean specifically an infrastructure, where there was a situation where there was the debt trap, they call it the debt trap, but they're beginning to learn that that's something that I think they've seen is not going to be good for not only for their reputation, but for the relationship that they have for countries. So they're seeing this program to be more viable now for many countries, and they're very aggressive, not only in the ASEAN region, but in Africa as well. So, as the ambassador said, it is really a challenge now for not only for the United States, but for the Western world, that China is aggressively using its economic power to be able to influence a lot of changes in the world order. And clearly in our region, it is control of an area where trillions of dollars pass through in trade. And so if we don't move quickly in terms of the economic powerhouse that China is offering to the world, then we may be facing a much bigger problem later on. And I think that it's clear that something has to, GSP is just one of the many things, the many tools that we need to be able to fight back on this type of situation.
Right. And I think the United States really does deliver a lot of values and best practices when we do these trade relationships with the developing countries. That is, gets our perspective on business across globally and is helpful. Any thoughts?
But yeah, well, if I could just say, I think that, to make GSP a priority in these next few months, with the possibility of maybe there's an opportunity in the lame duck session, I think it's important to, the message you've been taking to the Hill, and there's been a lot of work done about this lessens our reliance on China. This is great for, it's really a substitute for foreign aid in the sense it's mutually beneficial to both countries. It helps with friendshoring. It helps with manufacturing competitiveness, all the things we've heard today. And I know that there's been talk with members of Congress about this, and I think it's now time to go to the next level, because in a lame duck session, the leadership isn't really going to take on this issue. They're going to be busy with funding issues. So it's going to be up to the leadership of the Ways and Means and Finance Committee to say to leadership, we need this bill. So they're going to need to hear from the sponsors of this legislation. So it's like taking it to the next step. You've been meeting with members of Congress who support the legislation, getting their commitments, making sure they understand all the nuances of the benefits of this. But now they then need to go to those leaders. And I know when I was working on tax legislation, I would say, what am I hearing from members of Congress who I will actually need to vote for this? Are they asking for this? And so when people would come to me and say they needed the legislation, so that's what I would advise that you do. And you do have this issue of, this requirement that some are asking that TAA be attached to GSP. And a lot of issues in Congress travel in tandem. TAA is actually, but there has to be some sort of parity between the issues. And TAA is in parity with a free trade agreement with Colombia or some other country. But with GSP, TAA is kind of a big ask to put on that. So that's why you're seeing this resistance on having that be applied, but you're seeing it's a key issue for labor. We're in this election phase, and so, nothing is going to happen, but you can still make the case there. So this would just be my advice going forward, and I think there is a chance to get it done, because you can never assume that something won't happen, as I mentioned before. But I think that's really the advice I'd give on this, and I think there's an opportunity. And when I was looking at some of the legislation, I think the Blake Moore, Susan Del Bean bill, the bipartisan GSP bill, said, to stop reliance on China, and so that there's bipartisan support on that in the Congress. That is a goal. So you've got a lot of things you can talk about there, but making it have a priority and having it sort of get the kind of air that it's going to need to get over the finish line before the end of the year. And there will be some things that move, I think.
Good. All right, so we're now ready for questions, and we'd like to have an active discussion. This has been a positive, I think, perspective on renewing GSP, but we want to keep it a lively debate. So if others have concerns or things they want to raise, we'd appreciate it. Tom, let's see. And please identify yourself.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an editorial contributor on technology policy for the Hill newspaper. And my question goes back to something that came up in the discussion, and that is the conditions put on GSP. And for those of us who are not familiar with all 88 conditions, whatever they are, could any of the panelists talk a little bit more about what these conditions are, which of them are most problematic, and whether there are any new conditions that are floating given times have changed, priorities have changed. We have lots of mandates that have come up in the past 20 years. Are any of those floating up as new conditions? So could you just expand the discussion of conditionality for GSP? Thank you.
As the moderator, I'm going to defer to the panel. So.
Well, I mean, the content issue is a big issue.
And that's the domestic content,
Yeah.
country content of the products.
Yeah.
And the labor too.
Yes. And we mentioned already the labor standards.
And they tend to be getting stricter over the time.
Yeah. This is something that's evolved over time, really, since NAFTA.
And they've been getting stricter, not just in the trade agreements that were negotiated through the 2010s, but if you take a look at GSP equivalent programs that, for example, the European Union has or Canada have, certainly in the last 5, 6, 7 years, they've been increasing the focus on environmental sustainability. And so we wouldn't be alone in imposing conditionalities. I think you have suggested where the problem might lie, which is there a range of conditionalities which takes it a step beyond where this would actually be worthwhile for companies or countries to continue to pursue? And given that it's over 100 countries that benefited in the past from GSP, the conditions given the country under discussion are going to be very different case by case. And if a reauthorization is loaded up, it'll make it almost impossible to administer it going forward. So hopefully there can be some simplification. But we're not out of the mainstream in suggesting that there have to be conditionalities that meet current concerns.
I thought it was interesting that you've got a fact sheet for each state on GSP, and you sent me this afternoon the Michigan fact sheet on that. And part of the reason GSP is there is to end reliance on China and have, friendshoring in other countries. And what was interesting to me is that in Michigan, 97% of the GSP tariffs being paid were for 301 goods. And so, if I think that's a little more nuanced, but that's part of the case that you need to make, that actually by not renewing GSP, you're really sort of defeating this object of the current 301 tariffs, which is to try to move production into other friendlier countries.
Yeah, that's a good point. They have no option, so they have to pay those tariffs.
Jamon Beck, I'm a director at All Right Stonebridge Group. One question I had is, we're talking about GSP renewal in the context of great power competition, but there are other arguments to be had that have been discussed by this panel: economic development, ESG, et cetera, et cetera. Regarding the great power competition and geopolitical competition argument, have you found that that's been landing with your constituents, particularly members of Congress who are going to be voting on this? Thank you.
Go ahead.
I haven't been lobbying on this issue. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think as we were talking before we came in here, what's interesting is that think tanks academics haven't looked a lot at why GSP is really good in terms of an element of U.S. balancing great power competition. And that's sort of kind of the new thinking we're trying to bring to the table as Congress considers this, because it really is, pretty clear case when you look at it in terms of diversifying from China. But it really, GSP's been considered a little bit differently. And it's an old program. It was started in 1974. And I think it's good to relook at it and what the world looks like now and what we need. So, but thanks for the question. Okay, we probably have time for one more, maybe. What do you think, Tom?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Julia Hopstock. I'm the head of trade policy at the Argentinian Embassy. So it's my pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to the CSIS for your excellent work on the GSP and for this event. As Ambassador Romualdez from Philippines said last night, we hosted an event, a GSP Day event, where we showcased the importance of the GSP renewal for the Alliance of GSP countries. We are 27 countries based in Washington, D.C., pushing for the GSP renewal. And for us, it is very important for our development, for the development of our regional economies, and for MSMEs. And it's not only important for the GSP countries, but also for the United States consumers, workers, and enterprises, as you have showcased very well in this panel. So in this regard, I would like to know and to ask, if possible, how do you view the GSP renewal passing Congress, given also the situation that some legislators are now linking the GSP with some trade preference programs, such as the AGOA or the Haiti program, that also are close to expire. So any views on this issue and how the GSP Alliance could continue making, of course, all type of actions as we are doing in Washington, D.C. towards the GSP renewal by this Congress? Thank you very much.
I can answer.
Well, yeah, you can go
No,
ahead.
you
I
go
mean,
ahead.
it's making, as I said, making this issue a priority, and it's going to have to rise to the level where members of Congress are saying this is what they need and for what and reasons. And there are you've got a number of co-sponsors of legislation. I mean, you've got the sort of groundswell to get it done, but they're just going to have to make sure that they communicate it's a priority. Because as I said, it's going to be the two chairmen, the big four, as I call them, are going to have to say to leadership, this is important. They're not going to say that unless they're hearing it from the co-sponsors. So that's what you need to do. And I think the why is, and it may be a little different from each member as to why it's important to them, but they'll need to convey that. And that's how you get it done there. You have to go say, this is what you need. And you just can't mail it in. Email doesn't work on the floor of the House. So that's an important thing. And again, I just think to be realistic about the possibilities, it's going to be difficult in the lame duck. But I think there's an opportunity there, and I think especially if you're talking to tax writers, you've got the UN Convention doing a parallel tax review, much like the OECD has been doing, and if GSP were to pass, that might actually have some help with some of the developing countries' concerns on their treatment under the OECD tax proposals. And the tax writers are looking at all of this. So it's another argument that you could make that it might be helpful there. But again, that's just how it's going to have to be done. It's person to person. It's a very relational business up there. It's a very face-to-face business. As you know, when you lobby up there and go to these members' offices, you got to go see them. It's hard to do, but it's important to do.
Good. All right. Well, I appreciate the high level of perspectives we've gotten here today. CSIS wants to keep the conversation going on this. We do think that there are implications for great power competition related to extending the GSP program. This is a good bang for your buck if you're looking for things to put a strategy together. So we appreciate your attention here, and any input you want to give us, we would really appreciate it, because I know all your countries have had different experiences. So thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you.